Hello, and welcome to this installment of the Future Grind podcast. I am your host, Ryan O'Shea, and today I'll be speaking with Chip Walter, author of the new book Immortality, Inc., Renegade Science, Silicon Valley Billions, and the Quest to Live Forever. While writing this book, Chip was granted exclusive access to some of the major players in longevity science, and it provides a dive into the lives, motivations, and work of some names you'll certainly recognize. In addition to being an author, Chip is a journalist, filmmaker, and former CNN bureau chief. He has written articles for publications such as National Geographic, The Economist, The Wall Street Journal, and Scientific American, and he has written 4 earlier books on topics such as Star Trek technology, the space age, and evolution, and we discuss those as well. And in case you missed it during our last episode, we plan to send an episode of the Future Grind podcast to the moon on board Astrobotic's first lunar mission. We plan to send the file on a micro SD card, and we wanted to provide you, the Future Grind audience, an opportunity to fly alongside us by sending your own digital files and photos to the moon. As an individual, this is your opportunity to create a digital time capsule with your story, your family history, and your photos. As a writer, artist, musician, or filmmaker, this is your opportunity to have your work in space. As a company or organization, this is your opportunity to make a splash by sending your logo, business info, or digital product to the lunar surface. All it takes is a $20 donation. To find out more and get involved, visit futuregrind.org/moon. That's futuregrind.org/moon. As always, show notes and links are available at futuregrind.org. We're on iTunes, Stitcher, and wherever podcasts are found. A video version of this episode is posted on Facebook and YouTube. Make sure to subscribe on all of these platforms, leave a review, and you can also like, comment, and share to spread the word. If you'd like to keep this podcast running, you can donate at futuregrind.org/support, or you can purchase some of our newly released products at futuregrind.org/store. Because of you, this is Future Grind. All right, and now we are here with Chip. Chip, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So, you've written numerous books, including on topics such as the space age, Star Trek technologies, and evolution. And these topics are quite different, but I do think they are all connected by that common thread of science and scientific advancement and understanding. And your new book, Immortality, Inc., you're tackling a whole new subject. So, how did this book come about, and what drew you into this world?
It's a couple of different things that I think brought the book together. One was I think I've always had kind of a fascination with this question, probably going back to whenever I was a kid reading myths and maybe a few comic books. And then the other work that I've done, the other scientific work that I've done and documentaries that I've worked on, I've just met a lot of different scientists. And actually this particular book, I think, came together or really consolidated itself whenever I was talking with a scientist by the name of Ralph Merkel. He's an expert in nanotechnology, but he was also one of the people that co-created key encryption technology, which enables us all to make transactions on the internet. And so we were just having lunch, when I was working on another project, and he out of nowhere mentioned that he was planning to freeze himself when he died, and then hopefully down the road, whenever the science had advanced to a point where he could be brought back to life and solve the problems that had killed him in the first place. And I just kind of put my fork down at lunch and said, really, tell me more about that. And so he explained, I put this all in the book. Actually, it's the opening of the book, but I explained that he just felt that, hey, what's the downside? Everyone's going to die, so I may as well give it a shot. And, I eventually explored this in the book, but it just began to make me think, oh, well, this takes some science, and this was a scientist. And it turns out there are a lot of people that are scientists that are involved in the whole company, which is called the Alcor Life Extension Foundation. And, so I just thought maybe it's time to really see where science is at with this question. This is a question that humans have been grappling with from the beginning of time, going all the way back to Gilgamesh and probably before that. I mean, from the moment that we became conscious enough to even think about our own death, I think we've probably been wondering about it. And so I thought, are we at a time in human history where science could actually solve this problem? And that's when I first began to look deeply into it. And then, of course, I found that there, were some incredibly, important scientists and some big money that was getting involved in this. And I thought maybe this is the time to tell the story.
So you mentioned that you do open the book with an exploration of cryonics, which is known in much of the life extension community as Plan B. And specifically, you do feature the work of Alcor to vitrify recently deceased humans and store them until they can hopefully be reanimated and continue living in a more advanced future. And there's a lot of interesting research in cryonics, but it hasn't been demonstrated to work, and there's a reason it's considered a Plan B. So Plan A, of course, is to stay alive without requiring suspended animation. And for the average reader, I imagine that the science explored in the rest of the book seems much more accessible and possible than what's explored at the beginning. Why did you decide to open the book with Plan B?
Well, the reason why I thought I would look into that was because I thought there probably, if you were looking for people around the world that were really determined to outfox, the Grim Reaper, it would be these people, So I thought it's just going to be real interesting to go there and see, well, what is the science and what is it that motivates people to feel that strongly about this? I mean, you have to fill out a ton of paperwork. You have to be willing to, turn over your life insurance policy or a big chunk of money in order to be frozen like this. And, so I just wanted to get in there, and I thought it would be interesting. I thought, wow, it's kind of a wild idea, and I'm sure that people will find this interesting. But as you point out in your question, even people that are there, they'd rather not be frozen. You'd rather not have your body, your life suspended like this. What you really want to do is you want to just keep on living a healthy life, and so I just thought it was an interesting way to open the book and get people sort of focused on the idea that it's even feasible to think about this, and then explore, the much more advanced science that is beginning to emerge and the kind of scientists and people involved in it.
Yeah, one of the first things I noticed about your book is the amazing cast that's featured in it. You have Google co-founder Larry Page, Ray Kurzweil of Google and Singularity University, Peter Diamandis of XPRIZE, Art Levinson of Apple and Genentech, and Aubrey de Grey of the SENS Research Foundation, just to name a few. And these are big names, and they are successful people that get things funded and are able to get things done. So when they start to invest their time and resources into something, people tend to listen. Do you feel that these names are part of the reason that this is moving from what used to be a fringe science to more serious fields of work?
Absolutely. I don't think I would. In fact, I can tell you categorically that I wouldn't have done the book if I couldn't get to people like Arthur Levinson, who's the chairman of Apple and had been on the board of Google and was the chairman and CEO of Genentech, the first biotechnology company, or Craig Venter, who was central in advancing the first sequencing of the human genome. Robert Hariri, who, kind of emerged in the course of writing the book, who's probably one of the world's leading stem cell experts. Aubrey de Grey, who's been, an important figure in longevity science now for a good 20 years, who's really ahead of his time. And Ray Kurzweil, who's maybe further ahead of the curve than anybody. An incredibly well-known scientist and futurist and inventor. I mean, he invented the electronic piano, he invented optical character recognition software, and whenever you listen to Siri or Alexa, it's really his inventions that made, that kind of created the foundation for being able to speak to machines and then have them talk back to you. So, yeah, it was quite a cast. But when I saw that those people were emerging, my biggest challenge was really, can I get to them, and will they talk to me? And luckily, I was able to get to them and spend lots of time with them and really learn about the work that they're doing. And also, I think very importantly, learn who they are and why this is important to them. What was their life like? What motivated them? I really wanted to write the book almost like a novel, rather than just your standard science survey sort of book.
Yeah, and I think that really came across while reading the book. And on that subject, there are many books that could be written about the topic of life extension. For example, one could focus specifically on the science and the biology, one could focus on the industry that is popping up, and you could also write several volumes just on the ethics and philosophical concerns. But how would you describe your book's approach to the topic, and what did you want to focus on?
What I wanted to do is I thought, is this really a time in human history when science could solve this problem? This enormously complex problem that's so important to all of us, I think, on some level at least. And so I kind of looked at it in a sense as history. I came to believe at the end of the book that this is going to happen. And so, as I was writing the book, I thought, I want to be able to lay out as accurately as I can that this is happening and why did it happen and when did it begin to happen and who were the major players involved. And that required that we look at the science, obviously, but also the characters, the people that were driving it, the money behind it. That's where Larry Page and Bill Maris, who is the head of Google Ventures, gets involved. And the sort of whole social context of baby boomers and a desire to solve these problems and Silicon Valley and its role in the whole thing. So that's the way I looked at it. I suppose a book like The Right Stuff by Tom Wolfe, which looked at the Mercury program, was sort of in the back of my mind whenever I was writing this book. And that's so I wanted to give it a real, integrated view of the world, not just do a lot of science and throw that at people. I wanted to make it truly accessible and compelling.
One thing that I appreciated about your book was the profiles of some of the companies, and in particular, there's a deep dive into Calico. And Calico is a fairly secretive company, and even for me, who is someone who is fairly active in this community, details of what they're up to are hard to come by. But you got that exclusive access, so how did that come about?
Well, I was able through Ray Kurzweil, who I had, as a journalist, I had interviewed Ray Kurzweil a few times over the last several years. And so I asked him if he had access, to Arthur Levinson and Calico, because I knew that that was largely funded by Google, and I knew that Ray Kurzweil was at Google. And so he was able to open that door. And he said, well, I think I'd like to talk to Chip, and Ray had actually said, well, it's okay. I think we can, don't worry. Chip's Chip, you can trust Chip. He's a solid journalist. And, and Art said, no, I think I'd like to talk to him. So he sent me an email and he said, can you spare 5 minutes to talk about this? And I thought, well, yeah, I suppose I can spare 5 minutes to talk with the chairman of Apple. So we had the conversation and we ended up talking for about a half an hour. And his biggest concern was that he didn't want to, over publicize it or, write exaggerated, anything that was exaggerated in the book. His whole thing is just let the science speak for itself. That's kind of the way he is. And despite the fact that he's the chairman of Apple, almost nobody really knows about him. He just tends to run things under the radar. And so for some reason or another, well, he actually still didn't agree to talk with me about it. And I said, well, why don't I come out and we'll talk face to face? And we did that. And as a result of that conversation, he said, okay, I'll talk with you. And truthfully, even other people in the company, multiple other people in the company that I talked with, some of his top people said to me, how did you ever get Art to talk with you about this? He just doesn't talk to anybody about it. And I said, I honestly don't know, but I'm glad that he is. And, there isn't anything special about it, except I suppose he trusts that, what I was going to write was going to be accurate and fair. And I think it has been, and he still feels that it has been now that the book is out.
Well, from my perspective, it was great to learn a bit more about what Calico has going on, so I appreciate you putting that out there. And
Yeah,
just to
yeah. It was fascinating. It was fascinating from my point of view, and again, honestly, if he hadn't agreed to it, I probably wouldn't have written the book, because I think you need to have that company and that person, involved and willing to open up. So I was very happy he did.
And just to give our audience an idea of some of the science and different strategies here, what is Calico working on, and how does that differ from some of the other methods of trying to tackle aging?
Yeah, well, I sort of outlined in the book how the approach that he decided to take with Calico, because whenever we first met, when I first started working on the book, uh, and I worked on it over a period of 3 years, so quite a bit changed in the course of writing the book. One of the things that Levinson said to me was, "I'm not sure that solving aging is possible, but we're going to give it a try." Uh, and so what he did was from the outset, is he split the company in two, really. And he said, okay, half of the company is going to focus on trying to solve problems with dementia and Alzheimer's, and trying to solve problems with cancer. And he said, and the other half of the company is going to try to tackle the underlying reasons why we age. And then he said, at least this way, we'll hedge our bets and we'll make some progress on those big killers. And if we can solve the other problem, then we'll solve way more problems that we face. Because as you know, the major reasons why we get sick, why we get cancer, why we get Alzheimer's, why we get heart disease is because we're aging. So in any case, he kind of took that double-edged approach to it. And then in the course of the work that he was doing, or that Calico was doing, it emerged that aging can be solved from a biological molecular point of view, because one of the things that Calico found is that there are animals, mammals, that live unusually long. And not only do they live unusually long, but some of them simply don't age. And that tells you that from a biological point of view, it is possible that evolution has come up with a way to keep us young. And they're mammals. There are two that are specifically mentioned in the book. One of them that was, very much focused on and really discovered at Calico, which is the naked mole rat, which I can tell you is the ugliest animal you've ever seen, but it is a truly amazing little rodent. And most rodents live for 2 or 3 years. These live 35 years. And not only do they live incredibly long, but when they did the science, they found that they're just as youthful at age 35 as they are at age 2. And so what that said was that they have some kind of genetics that enable them to, recharge, all the cells in their bodies so that they don't age, which of course is what gets us in the end. We deteriorate, and most other animals deteriorate. So what that told Levinson and all the people in his company, and they now have 200 people there, is what we have to start to do is, now that we've discovered this, and we've discovered this in other animals, orange roughy, for example, which is a fish that most people are familiar with, lived 300 years, whereas your average perch, which is very similar, lived 3 years. And there are several other examples of this. Bowhead whales, I went all the way up to the Arctic to talk with scientists up there where bowhead whales live, and they live routinely 215 years. And they don't seem to get dementia or cancer or anything. Something else eventually gets them, and same thing with the naked mole rat. So that's really the underlying approach that Calico is taking. They're looking at the genetics of what causes animals to age in the first place, and then by finding these other animals that don't seem to age, try to figure out their genetics and see what's different about them. And then are there analogs in humans that we can look at, and then can we flip those genetic switches and basically stop aging and maybe even reverse it.
You touched on this a bit earlier in one of your other answers, but one correlation you seem to point out in the book is the relationship between the fact that the baby boomer population is aging and there's a growing interest in life extension science. And some of the people featured in this book would fall into that demographic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is something I notice as well. I'm a millennial, but when I go to longevity-related events, I notice that the crowd skews older, which is interesting to me because if you're going to consider methods of extending your healthy lifespan, the ideal time to start is when you're young. Do you have
Right.
any thoughts on what role age plays into this? Do people tend to primarily get interested in longevity when aging brings their own mortality to their attention?
I think there's a couple of things. I think first of all, yes, certainly as people get older, it's just natural to become more aware of your own mortality. You start to see people around you that die or are dying. You see your own parents who are aging, and some of them may die. So that makes you much more aware of your own mortality. Uh, I also think the baby boomers in general, if you look at them as a demographic over time, I mean, I think it's 1966, 70% of the population in the United States was age 19 or younger. That tells you how big that demographic is. That's the baby boomer generation. So it's also an incredibly important demographic. So as they feel their mortality coming, then there's a bigger market there because they're starting to say, well, I don't, also baby boomers were, kind of a transformative demographic. They see themselves as big changers in the social world, the Vietnam War and the ERA and all sorts of massive changes that took place, you know, in the course of those years. And so I think that's part of the generational view of things. I just don't want to get old, and so how can I fix that? And then, of course, you have people like you mentioned. I mean, people, Art Levinson, Ray Kurzweil, Craig Venter, that are all baby boomers. And so they are in a position where they're saying, maybe we should look at this. I don't think they're trying to save their own skin, but I think that they are also aware of it. And as scientists, they start to say, well, maybe we can solve this problem. But it was actually Bill Maris, who was in his 30s. I mean, maybe he's about 40 years old now, who was the man that really came up with the concept for Calico. And I think part of that was because he lost his father at a young age. And that's another issue. In the case of all these scientists, they all lost people pretty early in their lives, suddenly, their parents, their father or their mother. And I think that had an emotional effect on them, and I think that's one reason why they got involved in this. So there's a whole lot of things, and then of course the science itself is becoming, until you could sequence the human genome, you couldn't begin to solve these kinds of problems. It's just way too complex. So we are now scientifically in a position where we have the firepower and the knowledge to begin to undertake these issues, and try to solve the problem.
Yeah, on this podcast, I talk to many people who are interested in overcoming the human body's biological limitations, whether that is the fact that we'll eventually get old and die or the other things that are holding us back. And I do find that common thread as well, that either people experience death from a young age and see death of those around them, and then that changes their outlook on the world, or they've had an experience while traveling abroad, and that often changes them as well. So those are the two things that I've noticed that kind of lead people to pursue this path. So that's interesting that you caught on to some of that as well. And,
Yeah.
and you have written about evolution and other topics related to biology before, but I think that Immortality Inc. takes that to the next level. Do you have a background in biology or medical science at all? And how was the process of getting up to speed on the science for you?
Well, no, I was not a scientist. I didn't study a lot of science. Ironically, I got my degree in English literature, and so I'm really driven by story. I think probably more than anything, but I believe that the most important force in world history right now is science. I think that is driving pretty much everything that's taking place. I mean, all the social change we see, all the advancements we see, all the politics that we see are really one way or another almost universally driven by advancements in science and technology. So I got involved after my work at Cable News Network, where I was just kind of a general journalist. I guess I'm just always fascinated with different subjects, and I thought, well, this is what's really moving things forward. And so I got involved in documentaries with PBS, and I learned a lot because in the course of doing those documentaries, I spent enormous amounts of time reading and thinking and spending time with Nobel laureates and scientists who are really at the top of their game in a whole lot of different subjects. And then that's how I fell into the first book that I wrote, which was Space Age, which is sort of a history and a future of the technology driving space exploration. And then I just had a personal fascination with what really makes us tick. We're an extraordinary creature. Humans are an unusual animal if you look at us that way. And so I began to wonder, well, what makes us that way? How did we get to be this remarkable creature that we are? And of course, that requires that you get in and really dive deep into evolution and biology, and I enjoyed it. And luckily, I was able to get to scientists that could really work with me, and I could pull out that information and understand it. It's almost like doing a PhD for each of the books that I did. And I guess along the way, I picked up a few things.
I hope to ask you more about your other books towards the end of our conversation, but for now, on Immortality Inc., let's talk about the title a bit. I know the word immortality is considered to be a misnomer by many people in the life extension community, and it can make one imagine something that cannot die as opposed to something that does not die due to aging. So for that reason, some people would see the word as conjuring up science fiction rather than the real-world work being done in labs and clinical settings. How did you settle upon this name, and how has the reception been?
Ah, interesting question. Well, the name was my editor, Susan Hitchcock, who came up with the name. And frankly, I thought it was a perfect name because even though nobody can really be immortal, I mean, the truth is something is going to get you eventually, one way or another, whether it's a lightning strike or, being hit by a bus or an airplane crash or something like that. So from that point of view, you can't be immortal, but somehow a book that just said Longevity Inc. or Live Long, and Prosper or something like that just wasn't going to work for the book. Also, I think an important part of the Inc. part of it was to say that these are companies. They're not academic institutions because truthfully, academics wasn't really moving the issue forward. It wasn't really attacking the problem. But it took a company like Google, or venture capital companies that were putting hundreds of millions of dollars behind companies like Human Longevity Inc., Craig Venter's company, to get involved in this and to say, let's just go for it. So that's kind of how Susan really kind of came up with that title when she was reading my book, and she just said, "This seems to be what it's saying." I don't know. I haven't heard people have asked that question. They've asked about the ink part, but I haven't heard people say, "Hey, you shouldn't say that," or "That's crazy." Hopefully it's a title, especially with the subtitles, that help people understand what we're really trying to go after here, because there is a quest, to eliminate aging and death.
Yeah, let's dive into the Inc. part a little more as well. To me, when I hear Inc., I think of a corporate profit-driven initiative, which in many cases that's what you're describing in the book. But at the same time, there's that popular saying that the only thing that you can't buy more of is time. And in
hmm
these cases, what people are actually trying to buy is time. So how much of this do you think is a pursuit of people wanting to extend their own life because they care about mortality? And how much of it is a profit-driven motive?
Well, great question. I think that let's just go back to Bill Maris. Bill Maris was he's now no longer with Google Ventures and had decided to leave on his own. But he was the CEO of Google Ventures, and he was in a position because he'd lost his father and he had lost his grandmother, and it just he just found that very upsetting. He didn't he thought, why do people grow older, and why do they have to grow older, and why do we have to go through this process where it's so painful. And of course, Ray Kurzweil had written about that too, and he had an effect on Bill Maris, and so I think those things were on his mind. And then when he brought them up to Larry Page and to other people at Kleiner Perkins, then yeah, I think that people just started thinking, well, damn it, why can't we try to solve this problem? We're solving all kinds of other problems. Let's just go for it. And of course, Google has the money, and other venture capitalists have the money to give it a shot. I think in the case of Google, what they're basically saying is, and they've done this with other efforts as well, they call it a moonshot. And they say, well, if it works, great. If it doesn't, yeah, we'll have lost a lot of money, but it's not going to put us out of business. And so down the road, yeah, maybe we make a whole lot of money out of this, but also we'll have transformed society. So I think they really considered that part of it more important. When you sit down and talk with Art Levinson, he'll say, I'm not here to try to save my own skin. I just think that it's kind of terrible that so many people die and suffer from aging. So if we could solve this problem, wouldn't that be great? We try to solve problems with cancer and Alzheimer's and heart disease. Instead of taking this whack-a-mole approach where we're trying to extend life in each of those diseases, why don't we just solve the underlying reason why most of the time we get those diseases in the first place? And I think that what Craig Venter wanted to do was he wanted to use the power of the human genome, which is his thing, to truly understand why we age and to extend life and make it healthier. This is a big issue. You don't want to just get old and live a long time. We're already doing that. You want to live a long life and you want to live it healthfully. And so health span is important. So again, I think there are lots of different threads that are at work. That's kind of how I see it.
Well, I think you highlighted something very important there, and that is the difference between lifespan and health span. A lot of the issues that people bring up when they think about the concerns of an aging population can be eliminated if you extend health span in addition to lifespan. So I think that's really where the focus is. But staying with that, let's say that the companies and individuals you profile in the book end up succeeding, so that aging can be stopped and reversed, and humans can live well beyond today's limits. Even in this scenario, there are a lot of potential problems. People bring up overpopulation and immortal dictators and economic instability and extreme class divides, just to name a few. Are any of these things particular concerns for you? Are there any possible societal impacts of extending health span that stick out to you?
Oh, well, yeah, a whole lot. First of all, if we, and I suppose we should make a point of saying we're not talking about people living an extra 5 or 10 or even 20 years. We're talking about people living hundreds of years. And that's the kind of science that this could change. And obviously, if we start to do that, well, it just capsizes absolutely everything. I mean, economics, personal relationships, religion, you name it. It all changes radically. And when you sit down and think about it, over the last 3.8 billion years, every living thing on Earth has at some point or another died. And this would change that. So there's immense ramifications down the line, and I'm sure that many of the ramifications could be unintended consequences. I mean, there aren't very many things that we've done that aren't unintended, large technological advances, and this is a huge one. So, yes, this question comes up a lot. My belief is this: if this happens, and again, I believe it will happen, it's going to happen. It's not as though people are going to say, that's okay, I'll die. I mean, there may be a few people that'll say that, but by and large, no member of the human race is going. If someone walks up to them and says, "I can extend your life significantly, and you're going to be healthy," is going to say, "Oh, I'll pass on that." So really, what we have to do as a society is we have to accept that this is coming and prepare for it. And how we prepare for it, is going to have to do with how do we handle population issues. You can get into a whole long discussion there. I mean, you can already see that human population growth is slowing, and it has been slowing since the 1980s. As women become more empowered, as societies become wealthier, as people become more educated, people have fewer and fewer children. Don't have 10 children. They have 1 or 2 children. So I do think the population, there's another shift that's going on that could have an effect on this. I think if you're living, 200 or 300 years, which sounds crazy, but that's really what we're talking about. The science is getting solid there. Then people may decide not to have children for a long time. They may have a children when they're 100 or 150. So, I mean, there are all sorts of scenarios that you can go down, and some of them might sound like science fiction, but I think we have to begin to deal with those issues. And I didn't feel that anyone would really listen to those questions until I first wrote a book that said, hey, guess what? This is happening. These people are working on this, and they may very well solve this problem. Then people will start to ask those questions just as you have.
Yeah, and I do think they are important topics to consider. And for the most part, I have listened to both sides of these conversations, and I've kind of come to the view that things like overpopulation and the economic concerns won't be as much of a problem as people are making them out to be for some of the reasons that you mentioned there. But there is a concern that I don't hear brought up often, and I think it's one that bothers me the most as a potential issue, which is the issue of whether or not we treat aging as a disease, which is important now in terms of funding and research and what can be allocated to what. But in the future, if this becomes successful and people can treat and reverse aging, it becomes even more important, especially in countries that have universal healthcare, because whether or not you have access to that life extension technology could often depend on if aging is considered a medical issue or not.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's not entirely clear, and I couldn't really get a straight answer on, why the Federal Drug Administration in the United States does not consider aging a disease. I think probably because it's just too far ahead of the curve right now. It takes time for politics and bureaucracies to catch up, and we don't have universal health care. So the way the FDA works is you have to have a disease. So disease might be arthritis, a particular form of arthritis, or a particular kind of cancer. Then scientists can do research, write papers, say, oh, okay, we think that we've found the underlying reasons why this particular kind of cancer, for example, takes place. And then pharmaceutical companies get involved and they say, okay, we're going to take that science and we're going to try to create pharmaceuticals and drugs that can attack that problem. And then they spend the next 10 or 15 years, going through trials and studies to figure out if that works. And if it does work, then finally the drug is out there. It's an incredibly complicated system, and I think that it's just going to take a little time before the FDA finally looks at this and says, "Oh, yeah, right. We all age, and there are biological reasons why we age, and it's just like any other disease. And so let's begin to do the work to solve those problems." In some ways, scientists are already trying to solve particular problems that are related to aging, and if they solve those problems, then they may also solve aging. Anyhow, yeah, it's a really complex problem, and we could be in a situation where people don't get access to it. But I do believe that there are an awful lot of incentives, and the market is so big for this that if we make advances and if the drugs are created that can alleviate or reverse or stop aging, that those are going to reach a broad audience because, well, everybody ages.
So, you did a lot of original research for this book by conducting interviews and explorations and bringing new information out. But in addition to that, I'm sure you read and referenced plenty of existing works as you were exploring this topic. So, what resources did you reference, and did any of them prove to be especially useful to you?
Well, yeah, if you go into the back of the book, there's a big index of a lot of the papers, scientific papers that I read, and books that I read, and people that I interviewed. You could go on forever because there's been tons and tons of work. I just tried to focus on, again, rather than write a survey of what everybody was doing, I tried to focus on the scientists and the people that I thought had the best shot at solving this problem. And so I just tried to look around and say, okay, who's doing the really top-notch work here, and and then weave it into a broader story of the science, not just the science, but the economics of it, the characters, and then these fascinating stories that I tell. In at least they're fascinating to me. The bowhead whale up in Alaska, and people that live unusually long in what are called blue zones, and going to Ikaria and in Greece and places like that, just to try to give a well-rounded view of why this is so important.
So, through your work on this book, you met and spent time with people who have adopted various methods of extending their own healthy lifespan. And as you just mentioned, you visited the blue zones and experienced life there. And based on what you've learned, have you made any changes in your own life? Do you do anything differently in terms of diet or exercise or lifestyle now?
It's a good question. I'm trying to remember what I've changed in the course of writing the book. Uh, Probably. Here's what I do. First of all, I think that everyone realizes on some level your life on a day-to-day basis is a lot more fun if you're healthy. I mean, you can just do more things. You're sharper. You can enjoy life more. So there are some supplements that I take. I exercise pretty hard. I believe that evolution tells us that if you get your heart rate up on a regular basis, pretty high, and then also get regular exercise, that's just the way the human body is built, and that's what it wants. And if you provide it, then it's sort of a way of sending a message to your body of saying, hey, you need to keep all of these cells up and running and working if this is the sort of life that you're going to live. I think you have to watch what you eat. Obviously, sugar it's a killer. It's just bad for you, and we all enjoy it, and so it's hard. And that's, of course, one of the biggest problems that we face in our society is that when we were evolving, we were out running around in the savannah and we're just trying to survive and get whatever we can. And if we can get some sugar and some salt, that's what would keep us alive. Now we have that available to us on a constant basis, and we don't have to run around for it. We don't have to work for it. We don't have to exercise for it. So we just get it. And guess what? It kills us. That's one of the reasons why people in the blue zones live longer, is because they eat well. They exercise a lot. They don't necessarily want to exercise a lot, but they have to exercise a lot because that's their lifestyle. And they get a lot of social interaction, and that's very, very important. Just being with people that you care about. We are social creatures, and again, this is an evolutionary thing. We need to be around people. We need to feel good. We need to matter to one another, and all those things extend your life. Now, what we're talking about with these is looking at the biology of it and flipping some of those switches, and it raises a lot of questions. But again, if what you want to do is explore life and enjoy it, then you want to live as long as you can and live well.
So, we've spent a lot of time focusing on Immortality Inc., but you have other books as well, and some of which we've mentioned, and I think all of them would be of interest to my audience. And one of these was called I'm Working on That, a trek from science fiction to science fact, which you wrote alongside William Shatner. And this book explores how some of the sci fi technologies featured in Star Trek are being created for real, and what others may be possible. But this book is now coming up on being 2 decades old, so I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on this now. Is there anything mentioned in the book that has come to pass, or is there anything you've changed your mind about in terms of what is or is not possible?
Well, I think we're actually getting closer. We're getting remarkably close in some ways to, the talking computers that were imagined back in the 1960s, even in the first Star Trek. I mean, even if you go back to 1965 when those first shows were done, you have Captain Kirk talking to the computer. It's called computer, I think, and it talks back and it provides information. Well, obviously, millions of people have Alexa and Siri and Google all over the place, and they talk to them, and guess what? They talk back and they provide information. You also have access to enormous amounts of information on the internet that did not exist whenever Star Trek existed, but were imagined. So those things, I think, are not only have they come, but they're accelerating rapidly. Um, Robots, androids, I think, we're heading fast toward that kind of technology. Some things probably are impossible. The teleporter, unfortunately, and boy, I think we could all use a teleporter. Anyone's had to get on an airplane. It'd be nice if we could just go from one place to the other instantly, but it takes an enormous amount of energy. We would probably blow the whole planet up just by trying to break down the molecules in a human body, and that's all written about in the book. But maybe what we can do is we can virtually send ourselves from one place to another. We're doing that now in some sense in this conversation that we're having. So I think that almost everything that was imagined in Star Trek either has come true or is coming true. I guess another example would be the holodeck. Facebook is working on this. Oculus is working on this in Pittsburgh. So what amazed me about Star Trek was how imaginative it was and how prescient it was. And also, one of the interesting things that came up in the book is when we would go and sit down and talk with these scientists, they were influenced by Star Trek, and many of them decided to explore those questions because they were inspired by Star Trek. So there's this weird kind of back and forth that takes place between science and science fiction, where they kind of are almost symbiotic and one drives the other. So it was fascinating to write the book, and of course we had a lot of fun doing it.
So, two of your books, Last Ape Standing, The 7 Million Year Story of How and Why We Survived, and Thumbs, Toes, and Tears and Other Traits That Make Us Human, focus on the story of human evolution. And in Immortality, Inc., you're exploring a new future for humanity, in which we are less the product of our natural environment and of our biology, and are instead directing our own evolution. Do you feel that Immortality, Inc. could actually be a continuation of the subject matter you explored in your previous books?
Yes. Yes. A- and that's very it's absolutely true. That's exactly the kind of I mean, in Thumbs, Toes, and Tears, what I was trying to do was say, what are the few things that have really driven human evolution? What are the few traits that we have that make us really different, and where did those traits come from? And then in Last Ape Standing, I stepped back, and it's a little broader story. It's like there are 28 other human apes that emerged, over the last 7 million years. And those are only the ones that we found. There's probably hundreds of different kinds of upright, walking, intelligent apes that have evolved, but only one of them still exists. And we are that one, creature. Why? Why did that happen? How did it happen? And that's what that whole story is about. What were the vicissitudes and, just mistakes in some ways that made us possible, and then also what were some of the things from our evolutionary history that gave us traits that enabled us to survive more effectively than these other creatures who were quite intelligent. And then yes, now you get to the point where you have this creature, a human being, a Homo sapien, and it is doing extraordinary things, and it is rapidly increasing, and it's almost getting to the point where we've created a world that is not in sync with our own evolution, our own evolutionary past. And so we're changing that world. And in order to survive that world, we're changing ourselves. And we've actually developed the technology to change ourselves. We are now changing our own genetics, which it means that for the first time in all of Earth history, you have a creature that is able to change evolution, the underlying ways in which we evolve. We are changing that. And that is going to create a completely different kind of world. And that then raises all of the other questions that we've already talked about.
So, what is your current project? Is there anything you're currently writing or anything else in the works?
Well, there's a documentary series that we're in the process of working on and developing that would be a kind of sequel to this, would take the science further and would ask and explore some of these questions. Like what happens if this happens? How do we handle it? In terms of nonfiction books, I actually just finished a science fiction book that is somewhat related to this whole question. But in terms of nonfiction, I decided that I want to step back in some ways even further and look at water. It sounds strange, maybe, but the working title of the book is Aqua: A Story of Water, and you know, it's like, where does it come from? Why do we have it? How does it change everything? How does it make you possible, me possible? How does it make the planet possible? How does it make life possible? Where are the most amazing places, and how much are we damaging it? I don't want to make the book about, oh, we're destroying the planet, by destroying the water on the planet. I really want to kind of explore what water is. I mean, it's so rare. from the Big Bang to where we stand today, how did it come to be? So in some ways, the same questions I was asking about humans, I guess I'm asking about water. But of course, it's all so related to life, our future, and what makes us human that I just think it's a fascinating question to explore. One quick example would be if you don't have water on Earth, and how did that happen? Then you don't have wind. And if you didn't have wind, then you wouldn't have had navigation. And without navigation, you wouldn't have trade, and you wouldn't have had the economics that humans developed, over so much time. And so one of my goals here is to go around the world and hit all 7 continents and go to some of these amazing places and just see what it has to teach us.
Well, I had mentioned earlier that life extension was a broad topic of which many books could be written, and I can't imagine trying to tackle the concept of water in a single book. So you have quite a daunting task ahead of you, but I definitely look forward to what you put together there. So where are your books available? Where can people get them, and where can they find out more or follow along with your adventures?
Oh, well, first of all, the book should be available in most bookstores. I guess some of the older ones, you might have to order them, but they're all available on Amazon or Barnes and Noble online. So they're all available online. I suppose the best way to stay in touch with what I'm doing, I've been lucky enough to work with National Geographic and a lot of other magazines, Slate and the Wall Street Journal, The Economist. The best thing, if you want to read some of the blogs, some of the explorations that I've done to go to these places, is to go to my website, which is www.chipwalter.com. And feel free to drop me. I mean, when you go to the website, you can send me an email. And I've also created a gallery, and I've been lucky enough to travel, to 6 continents so far, and I've taken a lot of photographs of those places, and I write about them, and they're really only available on my website. So I hope that people will come and just check it out.
Great. I'll make sure to put links to your books and everything else we mentioned in the show notes at futuregrind.org, so anyone interested in checking them out can find them there. Chip, thanks again for joining me on the podcast.
It was a pleasure. Thank you. Great questions.
Hey everyone, Ryan O'Shea again, and thanks for listening to my interview with Chip. Remember to check out the show notes and more at futuregrind.org. Make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and you can also like, comment, and share to spread the word. We also need your help to keep this podcast running. You can donate at futuregrind.org/support or make a purchase at futuregrind.org/store. And don't forget, we're offering you the opportunity to send your files and photos to the moon alongside an episode of this podcast. To find out more, go to futuregrind.org/moon. That's futuregrind.org/moon. Till next time, this is Future Grind.